This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this webinar will be about land use, housing, and community engagement. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's training. My name is Christina Harris, and I'm a manager at the Metropolitan Planning Council, otherwise known as MPC. MPC is an urban planning policy organization dedicated to building a Chicago that works for everyone. We are independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan, and we do not endorse candidates, but we wanted to provide today's webinar on housing, community development, and land use to equip you with the facts you need to tackle issues in city council and in your ward. Before we begin, I want to provide a few housekeeping notes. Because of the number of participants, everyone will be kept on mute for the duration of this webinar, but we invite you to join the conversation by submitting questions using the chat function on your screen to organizer only. You can find this chat function in your GoToMeeting control panel toward the bottom. When you submit your comments, you'll only be chatting with us. There will be 3 speakers today, and we'll divide our time accordingly. We will take all questions after the presentations. At the end of the webinar, we will also provide you contact information for each of today's speakers. So it'll be me, Christina, Marisa, Novara, and Kendra Freeman. We are happy to continue the conversation after today's webinar and invite you to reach out with follow-up questions. So as stated, I will be discussing land use. So Chicago is settled along its waterways, which served not only as forms of transportation, but was where industry also took hold. Growth remnated out of these waterways and onto major transportation corridors, such as rail. Remnants of industry that was present currently aligns the Chicago River still, which is evidenced by several industrial corridors. As train lines developed, pattern of land use largely oriented to canal and rail, where warehouses, industries, and housing for canal and railroad workers were located. Once highways and roadways were built, though, the growth pattern spread out along those major arterials, creating more suburban housing and other industries, which also relocated along those main arteries. The naturalistic pattern of settlement, which was predominantly along waterways and other topographic features, fell to the surveyor's grid. This grid created a square mile pattern of subdivisions as well as parcels, which was supplemented by a regimented road network. The grid and creation of land parcels and blocks allowed for an easier delineation of land uses and zoning to occur as part of a planning process. So what really is land use? Land use plans provide the current allowed uses for parcels. They essentially show in a snapshot of time what is currently allowed on specific parcels. Land use is combined with zoning to define what can be developed there, as well as what type of development can occur, such as residential or industrial, as well as the development density. There is an online mapping tool that the city maintains that provides information regarding how parcels are zoned, what their current land uses are, as well as other helpful decisions that can be viewed in making development decisions as well. So there are several key issues identified when we're thinking about land use and just general impacts to Chicago as well as the region generally. Land use impacts the local and regional economy. It impacts the local tax base through property taxes. Local assessments are based on current land uses, which can have a tremendous impact on the amount of money available to municipalities for things like school and city services. Land use is important to the quality of life. Having a variety of land uses in a neighborhood like park space, retail, office, and housing allows for an improved quality of life. There are places to go for recreation, shopping, and work, and these types of amenities are key to improving people's lives. So land use in key city areas is changing. As noted before, a lot of land was developed along the waterways and river courses in Chicago. And these areas are most recently becoming valuable real estate where it doesn't make as much sense to site industrial uses, or those industrial uses are now vacant. In addition, the nature of industry is changing and companies have different requirements than they've had in the past. This has opened up opportunities to re-examine the land uses and zoning of neighborhoods that are shifting. So land use and zoning can be a tool to promote greater equity or limit it. The types of uses that are permitted on parcels of land and in certain neighborhoods can either be welcoming or act as a barrier. For example, zoning that only permits single family in a neighborhood can limit the type of housing built within the community. Having zoning that allows for both single family and multifamily can encourage a larger amount of living arrangements that are diverse. This map indicates that property taxes are a significant source of revenue in Chicago. Money raised for property taxes pay for city services. Main source is often for schools. Land use diversity is therefore an important thing to have because it helps to stabilize revenues as local governments will not be dependent on only one type of land use. This diversity is dependent on a variety of factors: local zoning, infrastructure, transportation, demographics, market factors. Therefore, development decisions and changing land uses can have a large impact on city budgets. The mix of land uses and communities have a large impact on quality of life, how people experience communities, and really go on about their day-to-day. The Department of Planning is tasked with developing neighborhood plans, which include land use and zoning considerations for communities to ensure a mix of land uses occur across the city. This image indicates where different neighborhood planning activities have taken place, promoted by DPV. Most of these have occurred along the north, although there has been sustainable land use planning that has occurred in parts of the south side of Chicago as well. There is no comprehensive land use plan currently in Chicago. As noted previously, land use is changing, specifically around the industrial corridors. The city created planned manufacturing districts in the 1980s. The city has currently 15 planned manufacturing districts where zoning laws prohibit residential development and other specified uses. The goal was initially to foster the city's industrial base and maintain a diversified economy. Several of these along the riverfront have been rethought recently as the riverfront becomes more prime real estate. There is evident in the draft design guidelines, which are actually at the Plan Commission meeting today, that was talking about new riverfront design guidelines. So as development occurs along the river, all these developments will have to follow the guidelines that were reissued. So some industrial corridors have experienced more change than others. This here is a land use plan from the 1970s as well as today's land use plan that was prescribed in the North Branch Framework document, which is part of the city's new planning efforts for the industrial corridors. It shows how a mainly industrial district has been changed over land use wise to a mixed use district. And in order to codify these changes though, zoning changes need to occur. And you can see on the left versus the right, the color changes are apparent as the uses become more granular and less singular. So you can see the differentiation in blocks as more and more uses are allowed within the district. So new development opportunities, not just along the waterways, but in other areas, need to allow for the growth of a tax base and consider how the neighborhood areas will change as you encourage other infrastructure, jobs, and housing needs. One of the recent trends that we've also been seeing is the growth of vacant land across the region following the 2008 recession. So foreclosed properties and vacant tracts from properties that have been torn down. There's a challenge for how to manage and stabilize this land to make it either more productive for an environmental or economic use. There's a greater need for land use plans to help stabilize these communities as well as plan for the future of these neighborhoods. This vacant land does nobody any good. There is a decreased tax base from land that sits idle, and planning for these neighborhoods and phases will help increase productivity and recreate communities. Land use and zoning are powerful tools that shape communities, and they have the potential to create vibrancy and economic opportunity. So land use and zoning has been used as a tool historically to exclude more dense and affordable housing stock. Restrictions on density can limit the supply of housing in a given area and favor the development of single-family homes that may prove to be unaffordable for low to mid-income families. Much of the city is zoned to permit single-family, while a much smaller amount allows for multifamily. So it makes it very nearly unaffordable for a developer to build a multi-unit building with affordable housing given the amount of density as well as how many communities are zoned. Minimum lot sizes and parking requirements also discourage building affordable housing units. In the city of Chicago, 90% of residential land actually requires 1 to 2 parking spots per housing unit, despite the fact that many households don't actually own cars. Much square footage is taken up just for parking instead of making apartment units that could be more affordable. And minimum lot sizes restrict how small a housing unit can be. Larger lots typically are more expensive, and it prevents the building of smaller, more affordable housing units. This can inadvertently produce, segregation economically based on where people are able to live and what they can afford. In order to increase some equity and encourage it in land use and zoning policy, you should prioritize development near transit through transit-oriented development. Equitable TOD allows for the region to reconsider land uses and growth around transit stops and developments to be clustered around these nodes. You should allow for smaller dwelling units in the zoning code, and these dwelling units, we're talking things like coach houses, which can be more affordable and provide more options for people with lower incomes to live within desired communities. You can integrate multifamily units in what is currently zoned for only single family. That would require some changes to the zoning code, but that's something to consider as well. And integrate vacant land in neighborhoods into a comprehensive planning effort that allows for interim uses. Vacant land is not doing anyone any good. It can be a nuisance, it can be unsightly. Sustained planning efforts around vacant land and structures and neighborhoods should be pursued to get these properties and parcels back on the tax rolls, or at least stabilize communities. So why is this all important? So aldermen have significant power to shape land use planning and new developments in their wards and across the city. Recent examples just in the past couple of weeks. So Alderman Dow for the 78 requested a major change to the development plan for the Lincoln Yards. Alderman Hopkins requested a major change to a redevelopment plan there. So aldermen have significant power to change how the land is used as well as have input on zoning and future changes. So land use and zoning changes should be consistent with increasing equity and improving quality of life. The city is ever changing, where people live, the type of life experiences they'll be able to have is largely dependent on their neighborhood land uses and what type of uses are permitted per zoning. And if we're trying to make a Chicago that works for everyone, this is something that is very important. I will now turn it over to Marisa, who will talk about housing.
Thanks, Christina. I would like to spend a little time just on the landscape of housing across the city of Chicago and how it's changed recently. So this is a graph from the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University, and it shows changes from 2012 to 2016 in supply and demand. It shows that the difference in demand for rentals that qualify as affordable in the city of Chicago exceeded the supply by about 120,000 in 2016. So in other words, we were short 120,000 affordable units. That's up from about 8% in 2012. And just to give you some definitions on that, the Institute for Housing Studies defines low income as below 150% of the poverty line, which is $18,210 for a single person, $37,650 for a family of four. And generally, we consider the rule of thumb for something being affordable is that it is not more than 30% of one's income. So keep that 120,000 number of units in mind. It's one measure of the need that we have for housing assistance in Chicago. This gives you a sense of how the support that the city does provide to subsidize units is spread out. So you can see that we have about almost 23,000 in city-supported rental units and 2,600 in vouchers, in city-issued vouchers. The interesting part I really want to draw your attention to is the bottom two, which is you can see that we have 3 times as many people using housing choice vouchers as we have people living in public housing units built specifically for that purpose. So the way that a housing choice voucher works is that people who formerly either lived in public housing or have been on the waiting list are given a voucher that is intended to give them more choice about where they live, and they seek a unit in the private market from any landlord of their choice. The vast majority of housing choice voucher holders use them on the south and west sides of the city, and I'll show you a map in just a moment that illustrates that. And that's partly by choice, and it's partly because living in other parts of the city can be very challenging. So just to explain that briefly, rent levels are often too low for use in more expensive markets. Rent levels that are supported by the voucher are generally too low to use in more expensive markets. And the other piece is that we still experience landlord discrimination against people seeking to rent a unit with a housing choice voucher, even though that is illegal in the city of Chicago and in Cook County, because we do have source of income protection, but it still happens. So both of those factors, the fact that rent levels are often prohibitively high in higher rent parts of the city, and landlord discrimination, combine to limit the choices of voucher holders about where they can live. And this is a map that we created here in-house at MPC, and we did an analysis of where affordable rental units are located across the city. So just to orient you, the lightest colors, the lightest yellow is wards where there's less than 2.5% of the rental stock in that ward is affordable. The darkest color, the dark brown, is where more than 10% of the housing stock is affordable. And that's a combination of things like housing choice vouchers, like federal and state and city supported units, like low-income housing tax credits, and city supported units like the Chicago Low-Income Housing Trust Fund. So you can see that the vast majority of the affordable, of the wards that have the most affordable housing are on the south and west side, and Ward 46, which is uptown on the north side. And something that we have been spending a fair amount of time on is the way that historically aldermanic prerogative has been used to deny projects with affordable housing, generally for non-fact-based reasons. And we advocate for limits on aldermanic prerogative when it comes to affordable housing in wards that have less than 10% of affordable units. So we've proposed some safeguards in place that would say it has to go through a special review. There have to be time limits on that review so that projects cannot be indefinitely delayed for no cause. And that if in fact they are rejected, it must be for documentable fact-based reasons. So those are a couple things that we have been working on and advocating for to ensure a more equitable distribution of affordable housing across the city. We argue that all communities should contribute to the city's affordable housing needs, and you should not be able to opt out of that simply because you've received protests at the local level or other, again, non-fact-based reasons to deny that. So keep this map in mind as we think about where people have choices in where they can live. We believe people should have the widest choice. We all want the widest choice possible of where best to live and raise our families. And right now we think there's more that we can do as a city to ensure an equitable distribution of affordable housing. This is another map. This again comes from the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul, and this shows the way that they broke down the city into 3 markets. Lower cost, which is blue, moderate cost, which is green, and high cost, which is that sort of pinkish color. And I'll just break down what each of those represent. So on the lower cost side, the blue, the median sale price value of a single family home in those areas is $72,000 in 2017. And those areas are 78% African American, 18% Latino. So now we'll go to the moderate cost. Sales price value single family home is $203,000. That's 18% white, 29% African American, 46% Latino, and 6% Asian. Those are the green, the moderate. Then for high cost, median sale price there is $433,000, 60% white, 8% African American, 20% Latino, and 9% Asian. So just to recap, across those 3 kind of buckets, low cost, moderate cost, high cost, you see a range of low cost of $72,000 as the median sale price, moderate cost $203,000 is the median, and high cost $433,000. So I think this is an important visual to help us understand the extremes to which we have different markets in the city. We are not a uniformly high cost market. We're not a uniformly low cost market. It varies dramatically based on where people live and the market in which they reside. And this is just to note that in the city of Chicago, we do 5-year housing plans. And last year was the planning year for the new 5-year plan that started this year, 2019. And that came with a $1.4 billion framework for city housing initiatives for the year 2019 to 2023. The stated goal is to provide support for approximately 40,000 residential units citywide. And the main change here is that after some years of having the Department of Planning and Development and the Department of Housing under one roof, with this new plan, the city has returned to a previous model, which is to have a standalone Department of Housing. And that was put into place officially as of January 1st, 2019. There's no commissioner at this time. We expect that that position will be filled after the mayoral election. All right, and finally, I wanted to just raise an issue here. This is just one example that gets at a bigger issue, which is we argue that as a city, we need to put more of our own dollars into affordable housing. Our analysis that we did with the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability shows that the city contributes somewhere between 0.3% or up to 1.5%, depending on what you argue should be counted on affordable housing. So basically 1.5% or less of the city's own money goes into affordable housing. And it's clear that that's simply not enough, given that the federal and state dollars are insufficient and dwindling. So one of the arguments we've made is for establishing a graduated real estate transfer tax that would allow for, according to our models, an additional $150 million in revenue per year, which is more than double. That alone would more than double the city's current contribution to affordable housing. And the reason we think that is a reasonable proposal is in part because right now we have a flat real estate transfer tax. So if you are buying or selling a property, you pay the same rate of tax whether you are selling a $150,000 unit or a $1.5 million unit. And we think that the better practice would be to set up a progressive structure for that, in which, according to our models, 95% of real estate transfers would pay less than they do now. So it's only the very highest value transactions that would pay more than they do today. So that's, again, part of the package of things that we would argue we need to be putting in place in order to meet the needs of residents of the city of Chicago who need assistance to live affordably, and that there's more that we can do as a city to contribute to those needs. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Kendra Freeman to finish up.
Thanks, Marisa. I also just wanted to mention before I start that we'll be taking and responding to questions at the end, but if you have any burning questions on land use or housing, you don't have to hold those questions. You can start putting them in the chat so we can get to those after I conclude. So community engagement, you may be thinking, why are we talking about community engagement in relation to land use and housing? MPC leads different initiatives that are really seeking to engage stakeholder participation and input in things like planning and policy design and obviously public decision making. So we thought it was really important to dedicate some time to talking about that, particularly in the kind of perspective of housing and land use, since those are the issues that commonly the public are responsive to and want to be engaged in as they're seeing the built environment in their neighborhoods changing and want to be part of that process. Also, community engagement is a critical part and often a mandated part of the public process, but it's not always executed in ways that build trust or legitimacy between the public and city agencies. So in part, we just want to look at some best practices and kind of hopefully field your questions about how we can do a better job of that, building that trust between government and public. So a few things about community engagement. First, lots of things probably cross people's mind when they think about community engagement. Typically, it's usually something that a project or an ordinance may trigger from the city's perspective. That, oh, I have this project that I'm trying to get approved by zoning or whatever, and I have to do a public comment period or a community engagement exercise. So I just want to start by saying community engagement first is a process. It's not a program. It should be something that's ongoing. And it should start really before any course of action is decided if you really want to have a meaningful engagement process. And it shouldn't end technically when your structure is built or when your particular project is implemented. It really should be it can be an ongoing vehicle to continue to have constituent engagement in your neighborhoods and in your wards. So the International Association for Public Participation illustrates that process of community engagement is moving from informing constituents about kind of information and data to really empowering stakeholders to share in decision making. And that happens over a course of different steps, which usually starts with a commitment to information sharing and keeping people informed, thinking about how we solicit feedback and acknowledging the concerns that are coming from the community, reflecting the community concerns in your next steps, and also inviting community to be a co-creator of solutions to the problem. So not looking for necessarily a rubber stamp or coming in with a preconceived agenda that you want the community to sign off on, but really allowing room to have joint problem solving is important. And also allowing for a process of inquiry. I mean, you got to kind of go through the steps of understanding the problem, dissecting the problem, and being open to different voices and thinking about solutions. Also, I think at the end of the day, there needs to be some shared decision making. There needs to be some reflection of the community's recommendation in the final decisions. And I think in addition to kind of like the information to empowerment, there's also an additional step that we recommend that's around community ownership. So beyond just the final decision making, which ideally would be one that's shared or influenced by community input, that how can the community continue to take part in ownership, whether that's activation or managing or maintenance of the outcomes. So a lot of times different parts or steps of this process may happen, but I think it's important to note in meaningful community engagement, these steps are really interdependent of each other. So even though they may be happening at different points in times, ideally they're interdependent and they build upon each other. So some barriers for successful engagement are things probably that a lot of us are familiar with. I think we have to be realistic in knowing that, the current realities that we face are shaped by past experiences, oftentimes at the neighborhood level, particularly with government entities, whether it's people's feeling about the Chicago way and how the city always kind of approaches things, whether it's a lack of transparency or feeling like, how do I get information? And I'm, from the community perspective, the information is never shared in a timely way, or even a kind of a history of past patronages. It's important to kind of acknowledge those barriers that are already there. Also, communities have been studied lots of times or have had many planning efforts happen. And oftentimes that planning does not come with resources to actually implement. So oftentimes you have this planning fatigue that you have to overcome. This information and having information without gathering input from the community and understanding kind of what's the pulse of the community is often a barrier. And bringing in the usual suspects, having your kind of key go-to community group or community person and not broadening that group can often be a barrier as well. And also the history of inequities, particularly in different neighborhood levels and between different communities, that's been a result of structural racism. In addition to a lack of cultural competency, can be a great barrier when you're trying to engage community. And then finally, just a top-down approach versus taking an asset-based approach when you're working with community. So why should you be using a participatory process? First of all, the public's voice is often reactive. As illustrated in the photos, I think lots of times community engagement consists of, here's a presentation, here's what we want to do. There's been a curation of what should happen without really any input from the community, and then the community's brought together and asked to really say, okay, that's fine. And oftentimes what happens, and I can speak from personal experience of being on the presenter end of this model, the community comes up and starts asking all kinds of questions, and it could be very contentious, and you're like, what? I don't understand what happened. We think it's, the goal is to move towards a model of being proactive in community engagement. How do we get community to the table in advance? How do we help them become part of the planning process that will build buy-in and support and hopefully more equitable and better outcomes at the end of the day? So I think a couple of notes about proactive community engagement. It could be a vehicle to build trust and legitimacy when that's a barrier in the neighborhood. It can also increase understanding of the public process overall for residents who may not be as familiar with budgetary constraints and other limitations. So there's an education process that happens on both ways. It's also an opportunity to practice trade-offs and hopefully get to win-win solutions or at least consensus. So helping the education usually helps people understand why trade-offs are necessary. I think more importantly, it builds civic engagement. So most people who are participating in an engagement process where they're actually having access to real data and some decision making are more likely to return and want to continue to be engaged. And also it's an opportunity to build shared accountability. So there's not just accountability at the city or the government end, but there's also accountability at the community end as well. So just to share a couple of common principles for effective engagement. I think one is acknowledging the power and privilege that happens particularly between communities and public entities, understanding the political and social dynamics that are at play, and building an environment where there's equal value in perspectives, and that there's a commitment to collective learning, and that there's a value in all the voices and in understanding and listening to multiple viewpoints. Being committed to a process is, again, it's a co-design with community partners, being willing to ask the hard questions, what perspectives may be missing in the group, or do we have the right people around the table? Do we have proper representation from groups who are being impacted by a decision? Also building an environment that creates learning opportunities to learn together, and the goal of continuous improvement, and that strengthens two-way communication. And then also the long-term investment into building local leadership. Beyond just having your kind of go-to community agency that you rely on to be the voice for that community, how are you supporting the voice of local leaders? How are you making sure that you have multiple voices at the table? I think one good example, just cultivating that leadership beyond the project is the Seattle People's Academy has a process where they've created a cohort training that's focused towards local leaders that helps them improve their organizing skills, build on communication skills, and also connect some local community-based organizations to different resources to continue to build civic engagement in that community beyond a specific project. So just a couple of case studies that I wanted to highlight. One is participatory budgeting, which you may have heard of. Essentially, it's when community residents are able to take part in the decision making and decide how part of a public budget is spent. And that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen in the school setting as far as having a line item or a portion of discretionary funding that's set aside for that public decision making. It's also happened in a number of different wards with different aldermen who's used that process. And this is just an illustration of the process that's typically used when you go through a participatory budgeting cycle. In 2012, the Great Cities Institute at UIC has been kind of like the lead university partner in a project called PB Chicago, which is Participatory Budgeting Chicago. And they're responsible for stewarding this initiative. They provide training for groups who want to go through this initiative and overall project management. And the evaluation of the process. And the first process was actually initiated with Alderman Joe Moore in 2009. And over the course of time, Chicago residents in aldermanic wards have voted on how to spend around $1 million in different wards. And those are on different infrastructure projects and different kind of projects that they've decided were best for their ward. So to highlight one example, in the 10th ward, they conducted a participatory budgeting process, which was part of the 2016 budgeting cycle. They had 8 events to collect idea from constituents. There were over 200 ideas that were collected. They whittled that down into seven ballot items, and then there was voting across the wards. And the projects that they decided on were street resurfacing, a dog-friendly area in Calumet Park, some resurfacing in another park, and then creating these archway welcome signs for their community. Another example is Sullivan High School, where the principal and the LSC actually designated $25,000 from their budget to go through this process of participatory budgeting with the students. And so PB Chicago actually came in and did an 8-week curriculum with the students to help them kind of work through the process and be educated on the process and develop ideas around what the student body should vote on. And at the end of the day, they had 70% of the student body who voted for a new recreation room, and that recreation room was added to the high school. So not a super complicated process, but good results and powerful results. Another example is actually a part of a process that we lead here at MPC, which is our Corridor Development Initiative. We also call it the CDI, and the Corridor Development Initiative is a site-based planning process that we work usually in partnership with public agencies to bring community together to help decide the future of a site that is going to be put out for development. So this particular case study is on the Washington Park Bank building, which was a vacant building at the corner of 63rd and Cottage Grove that the Cook County Land Bank acquired through the scavenger sale. And it was their first large-scale commercial property that they acquired, and they really wanted to make sure that there was strong community engagement in determining the future of the site. So we worked with them to really lead this community engagement process that would then inform the request for proposals put out by the Cook County Land Bank. So one of the first steps in that process was creating a community advisory committee. So we reached out to various groups at Woodlawn, from the large, very organized groups like One Woodlawn to very small neighbors associations, so that we got a good cross-section of voices in the community. And that group was convened before we started any of the external meetings to help us shape the meetings, help us understand what was the pulse of the concerns and the challenges happening in the neighborhood, what we should really be thinking about as far as content, and also to take a role in leading some of the meeting content as well. And also to be ambassadors at the community level to help spread the word and get their neighbors involved in this planning process around this very visible site at a really critical intersection in the neighborhood. Overall, the CDI process has 3 steps. The first meeting is really around setting the stage and helping across communities, you have people with different levels of information and different competencies and different understanding of development process. So part of it is just really, creating some common ground on education and knowledge and kind of centering people in the goals and the limitations of the exercise and helping them understand the goals of the site and the next steps, and even helping them understand the process that the bank actually would go through as far as acquiring the site and how they were going to decide for a developer to be chosen for the site. The second one, and we also did some small group discussions on community needs and community priorities. The second discussion, community members were broken down into small groups and paired with volunteer professionals who were professional designers and professionals in development finance, and had an opportunity to begin to build out what they would like to see as far as different scenarios for what the building could be: retail, housing, green space, parking. They got to play with all those different scenarios, and those things were actually captured and brought back and shown to the community. And at the last meeting, there was a forum of different experts based on a lot of the feedback that came out of the block exercise to really help communities think about the feasibility of some of the scenarios that they built and to make recommendations around them. And there was some consensus voting that happened afterward. So just again, a highlight of folks working together around the table in one of the block exercises. One of the, I think, important things that we heard from that was it was as much as the education and beneficial for some of the professionals who normally don't necessarily get to work as close with community as it was for the community members to actually work with the professionals in this particular environment. So just to share a few brief outcomes and kind of key learnings from that process. So the recommendations that came out of that entire process actually shaped the RFP for the land bank. The land bank actually committed to this ongoing process of community engagement. So they didn't go away after the 3 meetings were done. When they drafted the RFP, they held a public comment period, which they posted online. They actually had a community meeting to gather additional input on the RFP. They selected a community member to actually sit on the selection team to choose a developer for the project. And they made additional commitments along the lines of local hiring and MB and WBE participation, and actually hired a consultant to be able to track and recruit and report back to the community on their progress in that area. So that's a great example of community engagement, not just kind of stopping at the end of a process. And that essentially wraps up the community engagement portion. A quick few notes before you go. Obviously, yes, if you have questions, please start putting them in the chat box. We're happy to respond to those questions. So we'll go ahead and take questions now, I guess.
Okay, this is Marisa. Someone asked what we think is the biggest factor as far as location of housing choice vouchers. Is it landlord discrimination, or is it the rent levels? I talked about both, and I think they function on very different levels. Landlord discrimination is individual, right? That is individual actors making decisions that have racially discriminatory outcomes. and the other is structural. It is to say that even if a landlord really wanted to rent to someone with a housing choice voucher, if the voucher allowable rent was much lower than what they could rent for in the open market, they have a massive economic disincentive to rent to that individual. And that's a structural problem that has racially discriminatory results, regardless of the intent of the landlord, regardless of anything that the renter may be bringing to the table. So I think it's important to understand the different levels that those are functioning upon. And I would never minimize the impact of individual racism, but I think that our much bigger issues are around how do we change the structures in which discriminatory outcomes are perpetuated, regardless of the intent of the actors involved.
Right, so there is a question regarding how zoning can discourage the building of affordable housing in areas. So I've heard that approximately only 17% of Chicago is zoned for multifamily, with the rest being single family. So right there, there's a really small portion of where multifamily housing can be placed, which creates limitations on affordability for many people throughout Chicagoland. So zoning is prescribing the types of land uses and the types of density that can occur in these areas. And so it becomes much harder for developers to affordably build and affordably price housing in areas where you can't even build it anyway because you're not allowed, right? And therefore people end up being tracked to certain areas. And so changing the zoning code or altering it to allow more multifamily housing to be built in across the city would help to alleviate some of the issues that we see in terms of tracking where people live based on income level, as well as provide Chicagoland that is more multifaceted and diverse throughout all the neighborhoods.
I'll just respond to a question about planning fatigue and kind of how do we do that better. I think a lot of times with communities' experiences planning several different planning initiatives that aren't aligned necessarily. So there may be a comprehensive plan, there may be a quality of life plan, there may be a neighborhood plan. And again, the approach to planning is not always from an asset-based perspective, or it's not always from a perspective that meets the community where they're at. So it could be coming in with big data, it could be coming in with planning jargon, it could be coming in with preconceived outcomes and not really creating that plan. Again, like we talked about earlier, kind of starting with the community, listening and kind of understanding what the challenges are and creating that plan around what the challenges, needs, and desired outcomes of the communities are. And I think that creates an atmosphere where people don't want to plan, or they're very leery of planning, or they say we have 5 plans on the shelf that you've told us our problem, 15 times, but we can't get to a solution, or there's no investment in resources that will help us actually implement some of these plans. So I think it's important. And I think what we try to do when we even do the corridor development initiative is to make sure that our planning is aligned with processes that are going to move. Again, like with the example with the land bank, that process was going to be set in motion. That building was going to go out for development regardless of the community engagement or not. But when we have the opportunity to really engage community in helping to shape decisions before they get to be final decisions, I think are examples of successful, meaningful planning and engagement.
There's a question about housing choice vouchers and our thoughts on changing allowable rent levels by zip code. And I'll say that in our report that we issued in May of 2018 called Our Equitable Future, we gave a recommendation after doing some analysis with Roosevelt University that the allowable rents be raised by about 33% in 8 community areas. And we chose those 8 community areas because in those areas it would make the biggest difference in opening up more rental options. So to give an example, one area was the Near South community area. Right now there are 0 2-bedroom units in that community area that would qualify for a housing choice voucher. In other words, the rents are all too high for the current allowable rent levels. If we raised it from 150% of fair market rent to 200%, suddenly you'd have almost 50% of 2-bedroom units in that community area that are eligible. And when you think about how many people used to live in the Ickes housing development in the Near South community area off of Cermak, and you think about the fact that the vast majority of them now have vouchers, I think they should be able to use those vouchers to continue to live in the area that they have called home for a very long time. And so that's part of the recommendation that we've made, and we're in conversation about the feasibility of that going forward.
So there's a question about effective ways to bring in members of the community that aren't part of the usual suspects. How do you bring those folks into a planning process? I think you have to be thoughtful about outreach and who you're outreaching to. Oftentimes most communities have like at least one community leader that everybody knows. And a lot of times the temptation is to go to that agency and kind of stop there. In fact, I've been told, hey, just talk to that person. You don't have to talk to anybody else in the community. So you have to push past that. You have to talk to the local block clubs. You have to talk to the smaller organizations. You have to ask the other people who you should be talking to. I think also in thinking about outreach, how are you doing your outreach? If you're just doing kind of email outreach or really long notices with lots of content, you probably will just get the same people who are looking for that type of thing or who are already plugged into certain outlets. I think one of the things that we've tried to experiment in is just not doing kind of email distribution or regular posters or flyers, but doing things that are more visual, doing things on social media, doing text messaging instead of robocalling and sometimes robocalling. To get to that next layer of people. I also think you have to be thoughtful about when you're hosting your meetings and what kind of barriers that presents. If you're hosting things at 5 o'clock on a weeknight and your constituents are mostly multifamily folks, people have to think about, kids, and you're not providing childcare. That could be a barrier. If you're not providing a meal, sometimes you're asking people to come in the midst of dinner time. That could be a barrier. So I think all those things play a part in getting people who aren't the usual suspects out. Another thing we did at one of our meetings is we hosted it in a school because we wanted to make sure that we had some youth representation there, and that kind of got us to another layer of participation that we probably wouldn't have had in a regular kind of environment.
We had a question about if we put limits on aldermanic prerogative, won't that stop aldermen who use that prerogative to do good things with it, like to require more affordable housing than the minimum? Won't that put a damper on those that are using it for good? And the answer to that is no. What we've set up is basically we're putting a floor, not a ceiling on this. So it is to say, if you are someone, and there are many aldermen who've been out on front on this issue, who've said, if you want to do development in my ward, here's what I require. I require this many units on site, and so on. You are absolutely still free to do all of that. All this is saying is that you can't do less than this minimum, right? And that is to say, when we're looking at wards that have clearly done less, and in some cases much less than the 10% threshold, then we need a different process, and we need a different level of accountability. But nothing in that process stops anyone from using their prerogative to do more than the minimum. It only stops them from doing less.
Okay, well, it looks like we are just about out of time. So thank you for your participation. Just a few quick notes before you go. First, we'll be posting the recordings of the entire webinar series on our website, so you can look for that. We'll be sending out the link to all of you who registered in a couple of weeks. Second, it's important to note that MPC is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization, so we're not able to endorse any particular candidates. However, we're very happy to be a resource for all of you. And again, we thank you for your participation and hope you stay engaged. We want to continue to stay engaged with all of you as you go forward to make our city a better place. So thanks again for tuning in and have a wonderful afternoon.